We will begin, everyone, and you will be getting your welcome drinks very, very soon. And when you do, you will assume that you are drinking gin, all right? Some of you might know some history of drinks and history of gin, and you will assume that gin originally, the idea of gin and the recipe of gin originally came from Holland. Well, guess what? You would be wrong, all right? I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Book Club at Oriole. I am so excited to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I write the blog, alushlifemanual.com. I am thrilled today to be here to discuss that alternative fact about gin with these two legends, and they are legends, Anistatia Miller and Jared Brown. And I am not the only one who thinks they're legends. They, last week, just received the Tales of the Cocktail Helen David Lifetime Achievement Award for all of their work in drinks. And I'm going to give them a proper introduction, and I will read it so I don't get anything wrong. And that means glasses. Anistatia, here, is director of Mixolani Limited, and is a multi-award-winning drink historian whom, after 35 years in the publishing industry, is finishing her PhD in history from the University of Bristol on the economic and social history of brewing in Tudor and Stuart Bristol. Jared Brown is co-founder and master distiller of Sipsmith Limited. Yes, he is the man. And a multi-award-winning drink historian with a few dozen books under his belt and a few hundred articles about drinks, spirits, and how to make them. Their books include The Dean of Spirits, which is here as well, The Spirit of the Cane, and so many more, including their latest, The Distiller of London, which is what we are here to talk about tonight. So thank you for being here. So, this alternative fact about gin, okay? We're going to use that as a jumping point into this book, which was written in code in 1638. All right? How did you even start thinking about this book? How did you even find this book?
I was searching for juniper in spirit everywhere, always. As a drink historian and as a distiller, I'm always looking for the roots and the origins of juniper distillates. And I found this probably 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, I think, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I looked at this recipe and I saw juniper, orange, lemon peel, spice packed. It's practically a modern gin recipe.
And then he woke me up.
Wait. We have to back up there a little. Now, you said you found it. Where did you find it? Was it just online somewhere? Was it under the bed? I mean, where did you find this book?
I do find a lot of them under the bed. We've got a 1,200-volume library of books on drink back to the 1600s at home. But this I found on Google Books, believe it or not.
And why were you looking for a history of juniper? Were you intending to write a book?
I couldn't sleep. Now I'm always looking for more of an understanding of the tradition of distilling with juniper, always looking to have a better understanding of gin.
And you thought it was important enough to wake her up at 3 o'clock in the morning?
And asked me if I was awake. Yeah, it was that important. It was that much of a eureka for him. So.
Done that since finding the earliest use of the word cocktail in print pertaining to drink, which was 20th of March, 1798 in the London Morning Post and Gazetteer, page 2, middle column. But there, I spent an extra 2 hours before I woke her, making sure that I'd done all the research around it, so she didn't just wake up and immediately gazump me by, oh, look, honey, I found something even better. As has happened before.
Now let's get this clear, though. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Josh, would you like me to hold yours?
No, you've already held 2 of my drinks. Thank you.
Well, cheers, everyone. Thanks for coming. This book was in code, right? So how did you know what you were reading?
honey, can you decode this thing? Can you figure out what it says?
Yeah. It's funny, they actually used a lot of astrological codes. And though we don't normally talk about this, Anastasia is one of the world's top astrologers. Among the other books that we've written together, the complete 21st Century Handbook for, oh dear,
Oh my God, you actually have forgotten the title.
Complete Astrological Handbook for the 21st Century, understanding combining the wisdom of Chinese, Tibetan, Vedic, Arabian, Judaic, and Western astrologies, a title I normally only use as a test to see if I'm allowed to keep drinking.
It's about 680 pages of, if you really, 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 really want to learn astrology, that's the book to do. But if you don't really, 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 really want to know, don't read it.
I would just go with another one, Perfect Match, Discovering Your Soulmate.
That's a lot easier.
So you found this book. I assume that the title was in English, so you knew it was the Distiller of London.
Yeah.
You opened it up online.
A lot of it was in plain English. Certainly the introduction, this attack on the poor quality of distilling, where distilling was unlicensed, and this shout of a need for improving distillation that sounded like it was written a century later, like it was written during the gin craze. So even that was just utterly bizarre reading that they were already seeing these problems. They'd already identified all of the issues and they'd already come up with a solution, which was founding the Worshipful Company of Distillers, the Distillers Guild, which Anastatia will go into.
Well, for people who might not know and who haven't read the book and don't know that much about gin history, you know, there's this idea that, and this is super basic, but that William of Orange, and please correct me if I'm wrong, loved Genever. And when he's from Holland, and when he came over to be King of England, he brought this recipe for Genever to everyone, or to London, and said, make this. Okay, this is the crib notes of it. They're still nodding, so that's okay. And no, she's not nodding.
I'm not nodding.
It's not
Oh,
nodding.
no, this is one of the generally accepted stories, and
Invented in 1814, from what I can see in print.
we've actually nailed down where the misinformation originated, which is so much fun in our line of work. Okay, here's this odd story, like the Martinez was the parent of the Martini, and it originated from Martinez, California, where a gold miner came in, paid the bartender a bag of gold dust to buy a bottle and make him a drink, and created it on the spot. And then that evolved into the Martini cocktail. We finally worked out that that story was created by a San Francisco ad agency in 1965 promoting Beefeater gin.
Well, maybe William of Orange's people, you know, created this.
Get my people on it,
Yeah,
and I'll make
exactly,
sure
yeah.
it's mine. Yeah.
So you found this book online, and did you immediately know that it was astrological signs and that they were recipes because they called them rules? You knew that immediately.
I'm an astrologer. Of course I did.
No, I meant you. So to bring it to her.
I knew
He's
enough.
been married to me for 30 years. He knows so.
I knew enough to hand it over to Anastatia very quickly.
And so then what was the process?
I went to the British Library. I got a copy of it. I sat there and went, okay, this is really going to be fun. Here we go, Junior Spaceman. Let's take a decoding lesson. The actual book, which is sitting at the British Library, has 2 pages in it that were handwritten decodings. None of this stuff was written in the book. You had to have the handwritten codes in there. That said, okay, this is what this means, this is what this means, this is what this means. And having 2 of them in there meant and you could look at the handwriting, was totally different. That somebody had actually hand-tipped these things into this little book.
And did you think at that point there may be a recipe for gin in it?
Oh, I spotted that right off the bat. That one just leapt out because the ingredients were not in code, but the measures and processes were in code. So I could see from the structure of ingredients that I was looking at a gin formula that just shouldn't have existed.
But there were 3 in there.
Yeah. There were 2 others. They weren't quite as accurate as this one. That was just bang on.
Well, let's go back to the book for a second. The book as a whole. Why was there even a need to, and you touched on it slightly, to even create this book? Why did the gentleman who write it feel that this was the time to have rules?
It wasn't the first time. He actually started by, once upon a time, there was a man called Dr. Theodore Torquay de Mayer, and he was the first physician to the king.
Which king?
James I. And his wife, Anne of Denmark, was the first to actually introduce spirits into the royal court for drinking, because the Danish used to love to drink in their court, and she imported it with her. But there was a problem, because there were apothecaries who were making the spirits, making the preparations for medicines. Nobody was controlling them at the time. De Mayer said, we have to have controls or people are going to be making stuff all over the place. I want a monopoly. What a livery means is it was a monopoly on making whatever it was for at least, in this case, it was until the 1670s. It was kind of a problem because they seemed to have it under control. The pharmacopoeia that was created was also in code, so that people couldn't just buy the book, find the book, and all of a sudden start making stuff on their own. Monopoly is a monopoly. The problem was that apothecaries were only supposed to do medicine. The other problem was there was this stuff called water of juniper. And people were saying, oh, I don't feel good today. I think I need aqua juniperi. Well, there were some really smart people who said, you know what, I think we can make this stuff too. If you get a still and you start, you can make it, I think we can get around to this. All of a sudden there were distilling shops competing with apothecaries. You needed a prescription to go to an apothecary. You didn't need one to go to a distilling shop. By the time the Worshipful Company of Distillers was established, there were 200 distilling shops, legal ones, in London alone. And they needed to keep their secrets. So both the Pharmacopoeia Londonesis was written in code and in Latin, and this one was written in code, but written in English, so these poor men who never learned Latin could actually keep up with their business. That's why this was done.
So they created the Worshipful Company of Distillers.
Yep.
And was it difficult for these other 200 to get in? I assume it was a quite exclusive membership.
Just slightly.
Yeah, so that they could keep control of everything and cha-ching and all the money.
Yeah.
And
you had to take an oath. You had to promise you were going to pay attention to the rules and regulations in the book. The majority of them had already started their businesses as vinegar distillers, because it was a really big business in London to sell vinegar for ordnance, for weaponry, that you'd cool off your weaponry with vinegar. And they had a big business going and taking stale beer from the Worshipful Company of Brewers and making it into vinegar. This new side business was the thing that said, okay, we really need to have our own monopoly. It can't just be you're an apothecary. We have to have one too. And let's start making this stuff too.
Was it just for money, or do you think that what the others, the 200 others were just creating was killing people, tasted horrible, was bad for them?
Oh, it was bad. It was terrible.
Oh,
Because they do.
It was more than terrible. It was murderous.
Because they do lay it on thick in the book, by the way.
And they mean it.
Some of the quotes are, they say, exposed to imminent danger, abuses, evil. I mean,
Oil
they really...
vitriol, turpentine, sawdust.
Now, distilling wood alcohol and selling that in your drinks, and that did happen in places that didn't worry about repeat custom. If you're in a high-traffic tourist area, they weren't coming back anyway, so you might as well give them their final drink.
So they are being truthful in the book about that.
Very
Absolutely,
much.
It isn't just about control. Now, to get into the recipes, or as they're called, the rules, there are a lot here. I'm just going to read a few. And they're all called aqua. And they have, I'm just going to read the English, the aniseed water, angelica water, wormwood water, clove water, marigold, caraway, cinnamon. A lot of them have sugar in them. These are quite...
They all have sugar.
They all have sugar in them. Some.
And waters were strong waters, alcohol, but they all had sugar in them because they were called sweets.
It was a legal term because eventually, not when they first did the livery, but or when distillers first started, but there was a point where legislation said, "Hey, we can't make any money off these guys because these spirits that have sugar in them are not really in context with what we're charging excise for. So we're going to call these sweets." Two pieces of legislation actually made specific rules of what you could do with these sweetened spirits all the way up to the mid-1800s. That's how long it lasted.
So since they have these, what I would gather are expensive ingredients.
Very.
Okay, I guess that I should turn that around and ask that a question. I assume that these are expensive ingredients.
Very.
And where, it is 1600s. Were they just all imported? Did they find anything that was local or use anything that was local to the UK?
There were some local ingredients. For instance, in the recipe that we're focusing on, there were quince parings and Cox Pippin apple parings used in the distillate. And this is the first spot that I've ever seen these used, and immediately went into our own garden where we've got quince and we've got Cox Pippin, and took the parings and distilled them, and it was a remarkable flavor.
So they knew what they were doing, I guess.
Absolutely. We have a rule in the distillery: nothing leaves the lab till it answers a simple question: is it good? And that ticked that box immediately.
I guess the only people who could really enjoy these were people with money. Because
Well, that's the difference. Now, you see, this is a fascination. There were two gins. We're going to have an argument in 2 seconds. Don't worry. He and I do this all the time.
that's why they came. They want
Yeah.
the argument.
Yeah. You see, hang on now. Gin wasn't called gin until 1850, 1840. Before then, it was something else. It was either Geneva, not Geneva, it was Geneva. There is a difference. Or it was called, my favorite ones, aqua ad crapulum, aqua fructum. Don't you love that? I love that one. That's my favorite one. Or aqua rosa solis proper. That's hard to say if you're just your basic kid on the street. So it was like the only people who really had stuff like the original gin or any of this other stuff were people who could afford to pay an apothecary for their prescriptions or pay a distiller to do their distilling for them. Can I go even further? Can I?
Absolutely.
Okay, because you see, unfortunately, people don't realize women and monks were the first distillers in England. Started with the monks. After the monks lost out from the dissolution, thank you, Henry VIII, women were the primary distillers in this country. And they had all these fun books to read, and they were making a lot of spirits. And even Queen Elizabeth was having her maidservants make her spirits. It was like there was this whole bourgeoisie and aristocracy that had really cool spirits, and the working class had to try to replicate them by making stuff. And I mean stuff. It was a definite economic change.
Oh, we want the argument. Are you going to argue, or should I ask my question first?
Go ahead, try me.
I'll let her slide on this
Oh,
one.
no,
This-
not the argument. That's over
There
here.
were only
30 years of marriage.
Only 2 gins, but I still say there were so many permutations around this concept in terms of the low quality ones that very quickly led to death, as featured in Hogarth's 1751 Gin Lane, or the ones that were good, that were drinkable.
And then you get to John Sheridan Muspratt in 1850, who called all 6 recipes gin. And only one was the stuff that made the gin craze happen, which was the West Country gin that was made with vitriol and turpentine. Answer that one, Benbridge
I guess
scholars.
this kind of touches on the question that I had, which is if these official distillers who take the oath are making those spirits, those aqua, of all different kinds, and selling them to their very rich clients, there must have been people who are making spirits, or whatever you want to call it. Also, at the same time, would it be illegally for the people who want to drink alcohol and not be able to afford the ones that are being made?
Yeah, and
By
they
these
were
people.
making it just with juniper or some juniper replicant like turpentine and sticking it into spirit. And it was called Geneva. Geneva is nothing but juniper and spirit. It has none of the other botanicals that define a London dry gin or any other style of gin.
This was one of your discoveries that absolutely blew me away, was finding that during the gin craze, where it was said in so many books that 1 out of 5 doorways in London would open into a still. There was that much gin production. There was that much gin production, but you found how many licensed stills in London at that time?
Only 200.
And the rest were actually buying base spirit from
Bristol.
and
it was made out of sugar.
So
It was
basically
rum.
a rum base, and they were flavoring it. And so many books said, oh, London gin, yes, that's flavored with turpentine and oil of vitriol, sulfuric.
So we
And,
lost track of all of it. We really did.
And the turpentine is just a pine distillate. And we've actually tasted a gin made about 120 years ago that was still made from that recipe. And yes, it did taste like paint remover.
Well, speaking of the gin recipe in here, it's the aqua fructum, water of fruits.
Yep.
Okay. There's a lot of ingredients, not just the ones that so juniper berries, quince pairings, pippin pairings, I guess lemon pills, orange pills, nutmeg, aniseed, clove. All right, that's just, you distill all that. To you, that screams gin when you read this?
Absolutely. Of course, you could rebalance those ingredients and practically make it ouzo, but when you balance those ingredients per the measures that they had, it screams gin. The only problem that I had when I found this, and I brought it to Sam and Fairfax, my co-founders at Sipsmith, and I said, I desperately want to make this one. And I discovered, because we'd just been bought by Beam Suntory, and Fairfax had made this flippant promise that we weren't going to pump up the value of the company by making some flash-in-the-pan product like a pink gin.
What color is
this recipe from 1639 was then infused with strawberries and raspberries and dulcified, as the
what color
recipe
is
said, so
this?
sweetened. So actually in 1639 they were making
Pink gin.
Yes.
And that's the part that I haven't read to you yet, which is, to the spirit add, ADDE, strawberries bruised, raspberries bruised, stir them well together, and after 10 days, it being clear, may be drawn off.
Yeah.
So that led right into that. Now,
But
go ahead.
wonderfully, and this I absolutely loved, because through our own experimentation, we found 7 to 10 days to be the perfect maceration time. If you want to make a raspberry gin, you want to make a home pink gin that will beat the pants off of any commercial pink gin, you buy a punnet, which is 250, 300 grams of raspberries. Put that into a bottle of gin, let it sit for 10 days, and then strain that off. And that color will hold for up to 5 years, a bright Zinfandel rosé color and a beautiful fresh raspberry flavor. And we didn't know they knew it in 1639.
They're making pink gin. Now, everyone, as you're sipping your welcome cocktail, you just think that you're sipping normal gin, right? Well, actually, you're not. You are sipping the original gin, and that's why it has a slight pink color, which Jared and Anastasia brought for all of you today. So that's kind of a surprise that we had, and we will be tasting it neat soon when it comes to you. So, which is really exciting.
At which point you'll find a lot of whiskey character to it because they didn't have column stills back then to make a very pure neutral spirit base. So they were only distilling up to about 68%, when today we're taking up to 95%, and then rectifying, redistilling with botanicals. So what you will be tasting is essentially a new make spirit. Anastasia worked out that it was grain, not malt.
And even more interesting was James Musprat as I say, in 1850, when he wrote his book, kind of alluded to the fact that as far as he was concerned, all British spirits, all, as if there were any other British spirits other than British whiskey, which there was, and British gin, were nothing more than the low wine fabrications of Scottish and English fabricators of grain spirits. That kind of gives you the hint. It started with new make, and that was actually the biggest difference that you could imagine in this world. Can you imagine if you had a Tory gin made with grain spirit versus a Whig gin made with sugar? Kind of a big difference, and kind of a big difference about the reaction of it. And it took a long time for people to realize they were not drinking the same thing. If you were talking gin, there was gin and there was gin. Well, which gin did you have? Did you buy it from the girl on the street at the hanging? Or was this something that you actually bought in a shop? And that was the legitimacy. That was actually the difference in professionalization versus illegal booze.
A gentleman, John French, translated, or whatever you want to call it, allegedly. And in this book, you have as notes the, I guess, the description of what ailment it would help. When someone was buying something from a distiller as opposed to an apothecary, would they be looking for that?
No.
No.
No. That was the point of difference. That was the whole point that de Mayerne had, is he wanted to make sure that people knew that they went to an apothecary, they were getting a medicine. If they were going to a distiller's shop, they were buying booze. And that there was a distinct difference between the two. Dr. John French wanted to maintain that all of these were actually medicines because he was being a nice puritanical person, versus being willing to admit there were people drinking this socially, even though it had been done since the 1500s. But we were Puritans at the time. You had to be nice.
Well, all of the recipes in the book, would people have known, would the common person, or I guess should I say the common rich person, know that if I drink this, it would help me with that?
Oh, most definitely. The number one cause of death throughout history was waterborne pathogens. The only known preventative, palliative, curative was daily consumption of alcohol.
I kind of agree. No,
And
always drink responsibly.
It wasn't just adding alcohol. Oh, yes, always drink responsibly.
And don't die like Tchaikovsky.
10 liters of this in a day, and we would stand around helplessly watching you die of a fatal electrolyte imbalance. Take that water, you're always painted as the good guy.
Now, do you think this was, or the recipes were new in here? So, like, this was the latest new cocktail book, or this was just nothing new?
Can we go all the way back now? Maybe
yeah, of course.
A couple of them, one or two. Most of those came from, came through via Germany, from a Viennese alchemist named, I love the name, Michael Puff van Schrick. I love that name, Puff van Schrick. Anyways, 1476. And Hieronymus Rorschach was another person who also found the similar recipes. These were all taken from recipes from the 1300s.
What was the title of Braunschweig's 1500 book? El Liber del Distillato?
Distill.
Thank you. Which was translated into English in 1527.
By Lawrence Andrew.
And this was the first juniper distillate
that the English knew about. They were rabid to find out this. Believe it or not, when the printing press was invented, the biggest seller after the Bible were distillation books. I mean this quite seriously. Braunschweig's book was 33 editions.
Hang on, say that again.
Oh,
that was fun.
Right after the Bible, the biggest selling printed book in the world was Braunschweig's 33 editions in different languages. People were that fascinated with the idea that they could make their own booze at home. And you could. You had a thing called a cold still. It sat on top of a bowl. You stuck that on top of some ashes, and you could distill things. It's been that long and been that early in our nature to want to play with something fun. It couldn't be more serious.
You know, it's funny. I read that in your book, and I made a little note on the side saying, how did they know that was the biggest selling book then? You know, what's there? There was no Amazon to count it, you know?
Yeah, but guys were actually keeping accounts of what was being published and how many books were being sold. And it was amazing how many books were sold amongst Germany, the Netherlands, and England on the subject. It was ridiculous. And we're not even counting in what happened in Poland with a book that showed 70 different ways of flavoring vodka, including with juniper, and in Italy, which I'm never going to discount. The aid were having fun too. It's just nobody was translating them in English, so they didn't import the stuff.
Well, written in Latin and in code was a bit of a challenge, but we have seen a 1186 recipe from the University of Salerno Medical School that could be talking about working with juniper and distilling, but the condensing coil was referred to as a serpens in this. And so when you're talking snakes and ladders, you can't be entirely sure if it really was distillation.
Mm-hmm. So I think everyone has... we don't have any.
No, not everyone.
No, not everyone has. We don't have any.
Does everybody have Everybody have a tasting glass.
Does everyone have a tasting glass?
Okay, we got tasting glass.
Because we've been talking so much about it, we need to try it already.
Okay.
If you haven't already.
Now give us some tasting notes.
Yes, from the master.
You all realize how fortunate we are, all right, to have two masters, all right, here to lead a tasting.
I still like this one. I like this one so much. Reached out to Auchentoshan, and one of the distillers up there had a load of pure grain distillate rather than malted, just grain, and sent me down a load of that to work with. Had been distilled up to 68%, so that was exactly what they were using in 1638 to make this. So as you taste it, it's a bit like a new make whiskey. It's got that breadiness to it in the nose, on the palate. It's got a natural sweetness to it. It still has that soft pine, sweet citrus that is characteristic of Mediterranean juniper. Back then, actually long before the first juniper distillates in Britain, they already knew that the Juniperus communis, which grows subarctic to subtropic all the way around the northern hemisphere, grew best in the North Mediterranean. Here you have the terroir, and to this day you have the terroir that produces the best flavor. English juniper, Scottish juniper, it tastes like moss. It's just not this flavor, but that's what they used. So that's what we used here.
And it's not too sweet. Even
No, no. Thankfully, the recipe indicated dulcify to taste. So kept it to that.
In other words, it didn't meet the legal requirements of being a sweet.
And I'll confess, taking some liberties didn't bruise the raspberries and strawberries. I froze them.
we won't tell.
Freezing just works
We won't
so.
tell Theodorus and
Yeah,
Thomas.
yeah.
Do
don't
that
even
with
bother.
your slows as well. It's like hitting each slow with 1,000 pins. It
Well-
breaks the cell structure. So that was how this was created. But this, I admit, I didn't set out to make exactly what they were tasting, but I set out to make what, if I handed it to them, they'd recognize and say, yeah, that's what we were trying to make.
Well, I think that's an invitation to open it up to all of you. If you wanted to have if you had any questions for them, don't be shy. Yes, yes.
Oh, this is a great question. What else is in this? And it really does have exactly the formula.
Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the question. Does it actually have
Oh, I just did.
everything in it?
I'm sorry, I've probably forgotten some of the things that you mentioned.
Oh, does it have
the
all of
question is
the...
what exactly is in this?
Yes.
And you've got the recipe in front of you, so please go ahead and read through that recipe
Okay.
one more time.
All right, we have juniper berries, quince pairings dry, pippin pairings dry. Now it's spelled lemon, Lymon, but I'm assuming that's lemon pills dry, orange with an E, pills dry, nutmeg with 2 T's, anise seeds, and cloves. That's before distillation. And then strawberries bruised, and actually it says raspices instead of raspberries. But I'm going with the fact that that's
Yeah,
raspberries.
it's
right?
raspberry.
We tried it the other way, it didn't work.
Well, I have to admit one thing. One thing I've learned about studying early modern European history at all, nobody could spell.
I'm not sure what are pippin pairings.
Oh, it's a type of apple. Yeah, the Cox Pippin apple is simply a variety. It's got a beautiful sweet orange character to that particular apple.
Anyone else?
It was so simple.
Oh, wait. The question is, how did you decode the recipe? With pretty much. She said a little bit more than that, but
Yes, how did we decode the recipe? It was so simple. I handed it to her.
It's like, honey, do you have any time to do this? And I'm like, excuse me, I'm sitting at Oxford doing my second master's degree on distilling, and you want me to do what? Give me a little time. Of course, a year later, he goes, honey, have you done it yet? No, I haven't had any time yet. I'm still working out whether or not there were women distillers or not. Okay, year later. You think you have time now? Yeah, okay, I've got time now. And then it was like, oh my God, you have got to be joking. Wait a minute, I've got to go to the library. I've got to go look this up. Wait a minute, I've got to see what I love this guy's name, William Y. Worth and John French had to say, because they said that they had decoded it. And I'm like, no, you didn't. You got that one really wrong. Somebody tries this, they're going to have cloves right in their face, no matter what. So, okay.
What was that measure? It was up by 100 times on the cloves.
How
their-
many cloves can you have in one
Deciphering.
still without killing yourself?
But you found, because one of the most available copies of this has 9 little dashes in the opening page. You found one that had the word invocators written
Yeah.
above those dashes, spelled with a Y as the first letter, and that was the key to breaking the
Yeah, it was like playing the game of the dancing men. It was like a Sherlock Holmes piece, because I said, wait a minute, that doesn't equal that, but that equals that, but that couldn't be that because it has to be that. But then that's supposed to be in Latin, but it really isn't that. And of course, I was supposed to be busy working on my doctorate at the time, and I'm like, wait a minute, I got to take time to do this because this is just insane.
Now you're still on the Oxford Masters.
Yeah, well, that took a while too.
Number 2.
Yeah, Oxford Masters number 2. But uh, but it was one of those things where I had to stop and take time and go over it and over it again and go, wait a minute, that is impossible. Go back to the library, look at what other people said. No, that's not right either. And when we finally looked at it and said, okay, I think we're ready to try it. Did you realize column 1 is for a large quantity and column 2 is for a smaller quantity? So if there was a small distiller shop, which one of the guys who was one of the founders of the Worshipful Company of Distillers was the physician to the Queen. He was Queen Anne's physician. Actually had opened up a distilling shop across the road from St. James Palace. And he had smaller quantities done up just so he could give them to royalty and to the court versus the stuff that was actually done for mass production. And that was the key, because it doesn't say that anywhere in the book as you're looking at small and large quantities. And it was like, okay, so they knew what their market was. They really did at that point. And they knew that there was going to be private stuff and there was going to be stuff that distillers are going to sell to whomever walks in the door can afford a minor fortune to pay for it. You take on the first part, I'll take on the second part.
Two wonderful questions.
Very good.
So it was, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I have no memory anymore. It was, when you're looking at an old recipe, how do you know if the ingredients still exist or taste the same as they did then? And then the second question was were there any recipes or rules, as they're called here, to help with mental illness?
And the first one, how do we know that the ingredients are the same today as they were in the past? And what we did was we began looking at exactly how those ingredients were processed in the past, where they were imported from, how they were imported, and exactly what 6 months on a sailing ship would do to those ingredients versus being air freighted in or grown locally. And with some of the ingredients, there were huge differences. And so you look at some of the old measures of nutmeg, and it's very clear that they were using, or actually cloves even more, that they were using stale cloves in England.
Yeah.
Because they would use a lot of cloves.
You're talking about cloves that had actually been sitting on a ship for at least 6 months, not including how long they'd been sitting at the dock before then. So they were also saltier than they would have been otherwise. And then sitting in the market, like Covent Market, or out on the docks in Canary Wharf.
For a year.
Yeah, well over a year. So they were pretty old.
So if you look at Oxford Nightcaps, which was published in 1827, was the first book entirely devoted to drink recipes. And a fascinating book. If you want to dive into that one, go to euvslibrary.com. It's a website that we created with a friend of ours to just get all of these books up that we were fortunate enough to acquire and get them up. No password, no branding, searchable across the platforms.
Absolutely free.
Got about
It's on their
150
website.
books up there. So dive in. But the cloves in those recipes, they used far more cloves than we would use today. And so we looked at how the cloves were handled versus today, and we had to adjust. But that's the case with any distillation formula then as now, because imagine if we lived in a world where no two cookers performed the same or even remotely the same, what cookbooks would be like. And that's how it is with distilling.
But it's also the organic nature of things, because even if you could get the same grain, and that's pretty tough to do, because when you're talking, especially when you're talking about new make whiskeys, you're talking about barleys. Barleys were different depending on the region you were in. So the organic nature of one barley to another is going to change the flavor of things. We can only approximate what we know. We will never be able to officially replicate any of this, just come as close as humanly possible, even though we have improved grain, we have better botanicals to play with than we did back then, because they weren't sitting around on a dock for a year before somebody bought them. But we come as close as we can. And we pray that we come close enough to understand what they were drinking.
Oh, but Smosh, there was another question about mental health issues in these formulas.
Mental health issues. People were really too concerned about mental health at the time, or this word well-being. What they were concerned about was your health. If your kidneys were bad, if your stomach was bad, if your head was feeling achy, you could have something to fix it. They didn't understand what well-being was. They really honestly didn't. I just finished teaching a class this afternoon on how much disease had to affect what the world had going for it. And no one really knew what to say if you all of a sudden, what?
They're all adults here.
Which?
You just said disease, a broad term.
Well, I was talking about syphilis and the plague. I have fun subjects to teach in school. But it was a matter of people weren't concerned about well-being at the time, at least in the Western Hemisphere. They were not concerned. They did not sit there and think about, even astrologically, they were not sitting and worrying about what the community thought. Yeah, when you look at one end of the hemisphere versus the other end of the hemisphere, one looks at community, the other one looks at self. This was a self-oriented society that created gin and created most of the Western spirits that we know. If we want to talk about the spirits that were created in the East, that's a completely different story and a completely different understanding of what regionality and organic nature does. So yeah, it's an impossible question to answer from this side.
From the European side, not so much, but we found that elsewhere in the world in that same time period, definitely.
Oh, definitely. It's just, it's apples to oranges. That's the problem.
Yep. Oh, this is a wonderful question. Which humor imbalance or deficiency would these waters be correcting? Of course, at that time in medicine, they studied the 4 humors. And
it's called Galenic medicine.
Very much, these were anti-phlegmatics. So treating the phlegmatic humor in particular.
You're talking about the kidneys, the bladder. In women's complaints, it was supposed to cure cramps. I found a great version of this in what's the name of it? The Treasury of the House of Euonymus from 1565, where they talk about juniper water being the best cure for the cramps. Ooh, remember this, ladies. It's supposed to help you in the cramps.
And what was the other women's complaint that it wasn't anxiety, it was something understimulation.
Hysteria?
Hysteria, my favorite joke.
One of the most magnificent things I ever saw on a drink was that it treated hysteria. It was like, ooh, this one's orgasmic.
I think that is the perfect place to stop.
No,
I think so. I think he's just gotten there, right?
Oh, wait, we have one more question. Yes. It's only they have to leave at 7:15. So, yes. Sorry, what grain?
What grain?
Okay, this is going to be really dead simple.
So what
There's
grain?
anytime before the 1700s, you're talking stale beer. You're talking beer in general.
And the beer was brewed on barley.
Well, not necessarily. Oh, now you're going to get in trouble with me.
Intentionally.
It could be a combination of wheat, barley, and oats, not rye. Rye rotted too quickly, but it could be wheat, barley, and oats. Preferably you would have it in barley, but as I say, the irony is a lot of what was actually produced in London until the mid-1800s was produced from spirit that was produced in Bristol, which was all sugar. So yeah, it's really fascinating. It was not all barley based. It sounds like it'd be clean and simple. It was not a clean and simple answer any more than the fact that ale was not replaced by beer. It wasn't.
But the best of it was barley-based at the time.
A great deal was barley based, and at current points we still look at barley for the same reason why later on in the early 1800s to the late 1800s, a lot of the spirit that was used for making gin came from Scotland until the government decided to stop that flow. And so it would have been a lot of barley.
Was the spirit we're tasting now distilled or compounded? And absolutely distilled, because it was distilled in the book.
It was rectified.
Ooh.
Yeah.
What ABV though?
The base spirit was 68, and then on the still, we did take it up to 82, and ran it off at 82, and then brought it to bottling strength here. I think we bottled this one at 58, if I recall correctly.
And if anybody wants to argue with you about your neighbor versus gin, there's a huge difference they don't want to discuss. Is your neighbor, up until about the 20th century, was a single shot distillation. It went from low wines to a single shot, and that was it. The one thing that made gin, and made English Geneva, was that it was rectified. And there are documents and books that say the difference between the two was the Dutch never rectified to a second distillation. They went single shot, never to double shot, never to a treble shot, let alone to multi-column distillation until after the turn of the 19th century.
Did you just save that up to the end?
Yeah.
That's
I'm sorry, I'm
huge one
irritated.
right
That's why he's married to me.
Well, I am so sorry that we have to end it here, and I want to thank Oriel so much for this. It's a dream. This is one of my favorite places on earth, and so to have this here is wonderful. And I want to thank Sipsmith for sponsoring tonight, and of course Anistatia and Jared for taking their time out of their really, really busy schedule to sit here with us and have a chat about their book, about gin, the origins of gin, and everything related to gin. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.